All right, we're good to go. Okay, so welcome everyone. Welcome to our little research talk this afternoon that Diana is sharing with us. Just a couple of notes then before we get started. What we've tried to do in this session is kind of encourage have a conversation in the question and answer in such a way that makes it manageable. So the thinking is that you should be able to chat directly to the host of the session. The host right now is Monica Besley. So with your chat function below, we believe the default when you try to chat should be going directly to the host. So at any point in time during Diana's talk, please feel free to put in questions. Diana has a couple of points throughout the conversation where we'll open it up to respond to those questions, not just wait to the very end. So please feel free to type them in as we go. And then Monica will put them back into the public chat for us all to see, and then we'll engage in the conversation that way. So that's the plan, at least. If things don't go correctly, please feel free to check your question, put your question in other ways, but we're going to hope that's the way that works. So otherwise, again, welcome everyone. Thank you to Diana for agreeing to do this, and I'm going to mute myself and pass it over to Diana then.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. This was the talk that I was going to be giving at the UW Teaching and Learning Conference, which would have been yesterday in the alternate universe where everything is still normal. And I thought it was really timely and a useful thing for people to know because lots of people are thinking about maybe alternate ways of assessing students that would work well with the remote practices that we're all having to do with for the spring and fall. So key tidbit about myself, just in case you don't know who I am, I'm Diana Skrzydlo. I'm the director of the Master's of Actuarial Science program, and I'm a continuing lecturer in Stats and SI, and I've been teaching here for almost 13 years. Ooh, lucky 13. So just a quick outline for today. I'm going to talk about what exactly oral exams are, including the different types that exist. My motivation for why I started using them, which many of those reasons continue today, especially in the remote world. Of course, there's benefits and disadvantages, so we'll talk about those. And then I'll talk about the format that I use for my oral exams. I've been doing them since I started teaching. I've done a ton of them, and I'll say a bunch about how I do it, and not saying that you have to do it that way, but it's a useful format. I'll talk about some things that I've observed from the students and some things that they have actually told me about the process and recommend some best practices and in particular how we can implement it with remote teaching. And I have questions at the end, but I will allow questions in between. So at any point if you have a question, please type it into the chat and Monica will sort of curate the list of questions and I'll pause after each, like roughly after each couple of sections to answer questions. So, my experience with oral exams goes way back to the age of the dawn of time. When I was a grad student, I did a research project on oral exams as part of the certificate in university teaching. You had to choose a topic and do a research project on it, and I chose oral exams. So I did a pretty extensive lit review of what was out there. And coincidentally, that very same term, when I was a grad student, there was an oral exam in one of my courses. So I had the experience both as a student and then as a researcher. And then now, since then, as an instructor, I've given oral exams to, I've counted last night, over 400 students over the years in a variety of Stats and SI, mostly advanced-ish level courses. So I've got lots of experience both giving, researching, and administering oral exams. So I just want to start with a basic idea of what an oral exam is. There's lots of different formats, but the commonality is that there's a two-way oral communication for both the questions and the answers. So it's an assessment technique where the questions are posed orally and the responses are delivered back to the instructor orally as well. And there's a great quote here that goes, as teachers increase the variety of teaching strategies, we need to increase the types of assessment strategies as well. So this is, I think, a really important thing, even to deal with this inclusivity. Like some people don't test well in like a time-limited crunch, write down all the numbers you can, exam situation, and they might feel more comfortable expressing themselves through a spoken medium. And so having a variety of assessment techniques, I think, is good for that aspect as well. I looked during my research at a large number of different types of oral exams that are out there. I'm not going to talk a ton about each of these things, but there are existing oral exams that we're very, very used to seeing. So obviously the one that comes to mind would be a thesis defense. So So for a PhD or possibly a master's, someone has to present their work and answer questions about it, and that's one type of oral exam. Oral exams are very, very common in medical licensing. So in addition to having to learn lots and lots of stuff, they'll have to do essentially scenarios. So they'll have, fake patients or, actors playing patients, and then the doctors have to try to discern what is up with them, what treatment they might need, and that's not just judging their knowledge, but also their bedside manner, which is extremely important for a medical professional. So those have been around since the early 1900s, oral exams used in medical licensing, and there have been many studies done on them. They're generally more, that's not what I'm looking for, reliable than a similar length multiple choice test on that same kind of thing, because some things you can only demonstrate with actually doing it. Language courses as well. Right? If you're trying to learn a language, the best way to demonstrate that you can speak that language is through an oral exam. Some of the other options, though, that I didn't really know of and have discovered during my research is a viva voce, which is used at Oxford. And that's kind of for borderline cases. So if you don't pass your exam but you're close, they might do an oral exam on that material and just to make sure that, you do actually know what you're talking about. So it's kind of a follow-up to a written exam. That was also used by Bodecker, I think I was in a physics class, where they were, if students wanted to, it was optional, they could one time during the term do a follow-up oral exam for a test that they didn't do particularly well on, or even if they did well on. You can have the exams themselves be optional. There's a great paper by Dressel that used that. Sorry, I can't remember the field that was in either. But it was interesting to see, of course, not everyone's going to choose it, and that cuts down on the administration time. But the ones that do choose it are going to prepare for it, so it probably is a good experience. You could use them in a small group setting. This is actually in the computer science course. Again, did that. And it was kind of interesting how it was administered, so I have the links to all of these papers in the references at the end if you'd like to look at that. So it sounds like a little bit unfair, but essentially there were small groups and there were questions with cards on it, and then whoever wanted to answer the next question could say, okay, I got this one. And so they would learn not just from the process, but from each other as well. And you could even do them in a large group as well. So that's a little bit about that. Now it was my first time where I was going to pause for questions. So Monica, if any have come in yet, there may not have been any, but if there have been any, I would be very happy to answer some questions now. So I'll give you a few seconds to collect. And if anyone does have any questions about any of these types or what an oral exam even is, please feel free to enter those in the chat and Monica will relay them. I'm not seeing anything, so maybe I'll give it another few seconds. There might be a little bit of a lag, so I'll give it another little bit, and then I'll keep on going. Okay, I think I'll keep on going. So next, I wanted to talk about my motivation for using oral exams in the first place. And basically, what it comes down to for me was some...
Sorry, just 1 second.
Yeah.
We did get one question that came in.
Oh, okay. Fantastic.
Yeah,
Okay.
It was sent to me by Monica, but let me just share it back to you then.
Okay.
The question was then, are these exams always one-on-one between instructor to student, or are there other permutations of this examination structure for an oral exam?
Fantastic question. So the way that I've done it, it has always been one-on-one, but you could do it in small groups. That might run into problems with it all being remote, but if you're going to continue doing this when you're back on campus, whenever that will be, then you could have a small group. So if you are interested in that, I'd recommend reading the paper by Caribbean, because it was really interesting how they did it. So you could do that, and then that would also cut down on the time that it would take. If you had, groups of 3 or 4, that cuts the time in quarter or into a third of the amount of time it would take. I've always done it individually, but you could make it work with a small group. Thank you for the question. Any others that have come in? I can hear Monica typing. You have a very loud keyboard. Is it one of those like mechanical ones? Alrighty. I will keep going then. Okay, so my motivation was, the tests, final heavily weighted exams are a very commonly used way to do sort of a summative assessment of students' performance and knowledge during the term, but they do have shortcomings. So you always hear about people who, don't test well. They know stuff, but they just can't demonstrate it in that way, in a time-limited, high-pressure, high-weight situation. One of the things that I hate about final exams, written ones, is that they can't ask you for clarification and you can't tell them when they're going wrong. Like when I walk up and down the aisles of the exam and I see somebody drawing the graph incorrectly, I want with all my heart to just lean over and be like, oh, I'm sorry, you made a tiny mistake there, but that wouldn't be fair. So that's definitely one of the shortcomings, the lack of instant feedback that you get in some other cases. It's not as easy. You can, of course, have high levels of learning with a written closed book exam. But if you really want to get people's insight into how topics compare with each other and have them evaluate or create new ideas, that's really difficult to do with a written test. Oral communication itself is a desirable skill, and especially if it's something that they're going to be using in the workplace, then it's important to be able to convey those ideas orally. I have TA'd, but sometimes marking lots of written tests can be time-consuming. Oral exams are time-consuming in a different way. And for remote teaching, especially, this is a concern now, that if you've given an online test with a fairly large window, you don't necessarily have a lot of certainty that it's the student's own work. Most of the time, probably most students are honest. I feel like that's worth saying, but you don't know for sure, and that's one of the concerns that maybe has come up with some people if they are used to using a heavily weighted closed book proctored final assessment, and that's now no longer an option. So all of those reasons are things why oral exams might be something you're interested in, and they do address many of these concerns. And they have lots of benefits. In particular, the thing that I think is the most interesting about them is that they're not just an assessment, they're also a learning activity. Like a well-designed written exam can also be a learning activity. People can learn stuff while they're doing it. But the primary purpose of final exams, I think, is for assessment, to figure out what the student knows. The oral exam, because it's kind of a two-way conversation, itself is a valuable learning experience. They might think of things that they hadn't thought of before, and they might get feedback and actually learn something from the process, rather than just taking everything from their brain and putting it on the page. They might actually develop new ideas throughout this process. As an instructor, I think one of the benefits is you really gain a better sense of how deep the student's knowledge goes, because you can ask them a question, and then if they gloss over one part of it, you can kind of probe that and be like, okay, wait, back up, tell me a little bit more about that. Is that always true? You can really plumb the depths of their knowledge and see how far it goes, get like a better sense of the granularity of, rather than just right or wrong, like how sophisticated is their knowledge of this topic. The other thing that's nice is that when students prepare for the oral exam, it also helps prepare them for the written test. Even though if you decide to use both an oral exam and a written test, this is a great benefit as well, because as they've studied for the oral exam, looking at the concept, that will solidify their knowledge that they can then demonstrate on the written test as well. One thing that I didn't even think of when I started giving these oral exams, but turned out to be really neat, was that it essentially is kind of like the interview process. So a lot of times jobs might have a technical interview portion where they have to explain technical topics, and students have told me that they've been asked questions in interviews with insurance companies that were literally the exact same question I had asked them on the oral exam, and they were ready. They were so excited. So that was kind of a neat side effect of this, is that it's kind of like a preparation for an interview. And one other thing I really love is just the ability to guide people in the right direction. So if they misunderstand the question, if they start going down a completely wrong path from what you meant, you can redirect them to the right thing that you meant. Or if they answer, very quickly and they don't really give a full fleshed out answer, you can say, okay, tell me more about this. Whereas on a written test, you can't go back and say, okay, let's try this again. So the ability to get the instant feedback is one of my favorite things about oral exams. They're not perfect, of course. They have some drawbacks as well, and I want to talk about some of those. Some disadvantages. The most obvious one is the language barrier. So if a student does not have English as their first language and they're taking an oral exam in English, that might unfairly disadvantage those students. Students might be nervous, especially because this is not a very typical form of examination in higher ed in North America. It is quite common in many other countries, especially in Europe. It's fairly common, but it's something that might be new to them, and so anything that's new, they might be nervous about. You could make the argument that it's not as objective, the grading, because it's impossible to if you're marking written tests, you could blank out people's names and just mark it. You can't blank out someone's face when you're sitting talking to them. So there might be some objectivity. Sometimes people refer to the halo effect, which is where you kind of read more into the answers of students you already think are good. So they'll say something and it might not be complete, but you might think, oh yeah, they know what that means, rather than really making sure that they do. So you want to just be careful to be as objective as possible. A major disadvantage, of course, is that it does take a lot of time to administer, depending on how many students you have. And there are some concerns with academic dishonesty if the students, because they obviously cannot take them all at the same time. There's only one of you. And so if a student tells another student exactly which questions they had, then that's possibly something that you could be concerned. So these are, again, some of the things that are a little bit problematic about oral exams, but luckily there are ways to mitigate all of these disadvantages. One thing that I think is extremely important that helps with everything, especially the nerves, is to give students very clear expectations of what you want them to be able to do. And lots of practice opportunities. So you could give practice questions. If you're in an in-class environment, I will actually put students into pairs and have them basically test each other. Or I'll give, practice questions to the TAs and the students can do like a mock oral exam. So just giving them lots of time to prepare and so they have clear expectations. That will go a long way to reducing the nerves. For objectivity, I think it's really important to have a clear marking scheme in mind in terms of the one that I use is basically I'm expecting 5 points that they need to make, and if they make 5 points, great, they get 5 marks. If there could be more than 5 different things that they could say though, so if I have to sort of give them a little bit of a hint towards something, then they can get a half point for that. So if they make, 3 points on their own and 2 half points, like 2 points with a hint, then they get 4 out of 5. Whatever you want to do, you can have various types of rubrics that you can look at. One thing that also helps with nerves and objectivity is just not having it to be too heavily weighted. That's just the way that I've gotten around that. I know that in Europe it's common to have very heavily weighted oral exams, and that's fine. I think in that case it might be good to have a second observer, either record it and show it to them or have a second observer in the room if you're in person. But the way that I do it is just not have it worse too much so people don't stress about it. Another thing that's nice is letting students bring in notes. That helps with nerves and with preparation. And for the time, obviously only using it when the class size permits. It's too big a class. It is too crazy. The biggest I've ever done it with was 60 students, which was too many. So 60 15-minute exams is 15 hours of oral exams, and that was too many hours. That was before I had kids, so I had more time. Another thing, of course, is you could make it optional, and then only a subset of your students can do it. In terms of the academic integrity issue, I get around that by creating a bank of questions, and then I'll randomly select the questions for each person. So even if they do talk to someone else, they might have maybe 1 or 2 questions in common, but when students talk to each other about the course material at a high level, I think that's good. That's learning. So having a little bit of overlap is okay, and not knowing exactly what the questions are going to be reduces the academic dishonesty. So those are some of the ways, again, that I get around some of the disadvantages. And I would like to take the opportunity now to, again, pause for questions. If anyone has any or has been putting any in over the last few slides, I would be very happy to answer them now.
I don't know if you see that one here, Hannah, that just came in.
Oh, yes. Okay, I can see what are the typical time frames of an oral exam. Oh, that was just privately to me. Okay. 15 minutes for student 10. Also, I would be worried that students are more nervous during an oral exam than something they're more comfortable with written. Absolutely. Very true. My very next slide after this is how I administer my oral exams. I usually do 15 minutes per student. And you're absolutely right that students generally are nervous because it's something new for them. So that's where I think giving them practice and giving them clear expectations can really help with that. So if they had the chance to run it through with a friend or do like a practice one with a TA or something, that would be one way to reduce the nerves. Of course, if people are going to be nervous, and your demeanor actually during the exam has a huge impact. Like if their first question, if they completely tank on it, and you look at them like, then obviously they're going to be more nervous. But if you're like, that's okay, we can skip it, we can come back to it. I think like giving students encouragement and giving them hints to get things going, and maybe starting with an easy question is nice too, just to get people's confidence up. Almost all the time, students kind of warm up over the process. I see another question here. Diana, have you ever conducted an online oral exam? I had not. This will be my first time doing it. So I do have a little bit more to say about how to implement it online or with remote teaching. So I will come back to that idea, but that is a great question, and hopefully I will soon, but I haven't yet. I see one more question. Question on the language barrier. With oral exams, do you find the language barrier better or worse than with writing? Might it apply to both? That is a really excellent question. I have always, in my written final exams, I always include about 20%, sometimes higher for fourth year classes. 20% of the marks are for things that require people to express things in sentences. And I teach math. So it'll be like, do this calculation for this pension plan, and then, what are the concerns with this person's health or something. So like something that requires testing higher levels of learning and expressing answers in a written form. So I already do that on the written exam. And you're right, I guess that same concern would be there. I think that's a really good question. I think people are more self-conscious about speaking than writing, but it's way less noticeable when you're listening to somebody versus when you're reading, if their grammar isn't perfect. It's so much easier to communicate verbally, orally with someone, because if they see your face and they realize that they, haven't explained something adequately, they can rephrase it, or you can ask. So I think the two-way nature of it, you're right, it maybe even is less of a barrier, because you can communicate in other ways. Like people can use body language, you can sketch a graph, and so that all of those aspects of communication help when you're doing sort of a one-on-one oral versus when you're just writing. So I think from the instructor's perspective, the barrier is actually less for oral, but from the student's perspective, a lot of students are really self-conscious about the way they speak, and so for them it might be more nerve-wracking in that sense, whereas it really isn't as much of a barrier. Fabulous question. Okay, a couple more. Do you have a good way to have students show a calculation in an oral exam setting in an online setting? That is an interesting question. When I do my oral exams, I'm going to talk about it in just a second, I focus not on the calculation part, just on sort of the more conceptual material, but I'll maybe think of some ideas for that. Do you have a suggested guideline of how heavily a final oral exam could be weighted? I'm thinking about doing this in the spring, I was saying about 30%. Is that reasonable? That, I can't say yes or no. It would depend on so many things. When I do it, it's usually not particularly high, and that's one way that I sort of get around the nerves. But in a remote teaching, it might need to be higher if you want it to be. I can't say yes or no. 30 sounds fine to me, but it would depend on so many things, including like the level that the students are at and the nature of the material. So maybe I can talk about that a little bit more, and other people are welcome to give their thoughts too. Fabulous question. Okay, Diana, would you consider a project or short paper presentation as an oral exam? Not the way I've defined it. So the key for an oral exam is that there's two-way verbal communication. So I think those are extremely valuable. Projects and short paper presentations are extremely valuable assessment techniques. So if you want to use those, 100% do use those. I think it's different, though, than what I mean by an oral exam, which is kind of questions and answers going back both ways, more like a conversation. I'm not sure the boss of what constitutes an oral exam, though, but the way that I think of it, I wouldn't consider that one. Okay, this is fabulous, all these wonderful questions. I am going to keep going for now, and then we can come back to any of these. Oops, I have accidentally clicked with my mouse. That will clear that away. Okay, here we go. So I wanted to talk about the format that I use for my oral exam, and I want to give a huge caveat, which is that this is what I do, not what I'm saying you should do. This is just what I have used that I found to be an effective tool. But if anything of this sounds like it wouldn't work for you, please feel free to change it. This is just what I do, not what is best or anything like that. So the way I do it is that it's worth only 5%. More for graduate students, I think 10% or 15%, I can't remember. And of course, if you're doing this remotely and you're putting this time into it, it might be 10, 20, 30 even, might be appropriate depending on the situation. I have my exams be open book. People can bring in whatever they like, just again to help with nerves. And I give 5 questions, each out of 5 marks. My time is 15 minutes, and people can just schedule individually based on what works for them or what works for me. And the key sort of implementation details that I use is at any time during the exam, the student can ask for clarification, or I let them know that I may ask follow-up questions. So there can be requests for more information from both sides. We can also skip a question and come back to it later if people are perfectly allowed to do that. I do use a randomized bank of questions that I've created, and I'll tell you in a second how easy it is to create questions. And I draw from that bank of questions in a way that covers the course topics equally. And one thing that I like to do when I also have a written final exam, I make sure that all the oral exams are before the written, and then I post kind of point form answers, not, you had to say all these things, but like here are some points about all of the possible questions so that students can review it and get the benefit of not just the questions that they were asked and had to think about, but the questions that everyone else was asked and also had to think about. The 5 questions that I ask are always the same. They are, easy it is to come up with questions. Define blank. Define something. Discuss the advantages and disadvantages of things. Compare and contrast two things. Describe the procedure for some method or algorithm or process or whatever that you've discussed in the course. And 5 is kind of, I think, my wild card question. So, like, how would something change if something else changed? So the students are told they'll be asked 1 question of each type, and I literally tell them, if you want to make up some practice questions, go to the textbook or your notes, open it up to a random page, point your finger at the page, and then there's probably a question you could make up about that. Or use the index of a textbook. That's a great way as well. Just look through the index of a textbook, and you can make up practice questions for yourself. And I encourage them to make up sample questions and quiz each other. When we have class, I actually do take 1 tutorial period to do this, to have people practice with each other, and then see how far they can get in 3 minutes, because 15 minutes, 5 questions, that's on average 3 minutes each, so I basically try to get them to say everything you know about this in 3 minutes. And it's good for them to try it at least once before the official exam. So again, question types, it's so easy. Just think of anything to fill in the blank. So we could say, if we're talking about today's presentation, define an oral exam, or discuss the advantages and disadvantages of oral exams. Compare and contrast oral exams versus written exams. Describe the procedure for, I guess that's kind of oral exams, and you can fill it in anything. And how would oral exams change if they were in person versus online, or something like that. So whatever topic you teach, I teach again statistics and actuarial science, but any topic you teach, it's relatively easy to come up with questions like this. Again, not that you have to do it this way, but this is a nice framework that will probably let you get something about everything you care about in your course. Just an example from the courses that I've taught. If you are not from stats or exercise, feel free to just switch off your brain for the next 10 seconds. So some definitions, advantages, disadvantages, comparisons, and describing the procedures for various things. And here are some statistical things. So it's pretty neat, actually, because my favorite one was compare the binomial versus the Poisson distribution. People are just, really good at coming up with differences between things. But when you ask them to come up with similarities, they're like, oh, how are they similar? It's hard to get that. And people really do think it's kind of neat to see their brains recategorize information in real time. So again, if this made no sense to you, no worries. Whatever your field is, you can hopefully come up with some important definitions, some things that have good and bad things about them, some things that have things in common and have things that are different from each other, and some processes that you want them to be able to understand, and then some wildcards of something. All right. I think now is as well where I was going to pause for questions one more time before the very last time. So I'm happy to take them now. If you have any, I might go back to some of the ones that were asked before to see if I answered them already. Having multiple people doing the testing has its drawbacks. That is very true. Yeah, so the way I've done it, I administer all the tests myself, but if you wanted to reduce your load and you were lucky enough to have either co-instructors that you trust or TAs that you trust, then that would be a natural way to kind of distribute the work between multiple people. That would be really, really nice to be able to distribute that. What I think you might want to do if you did that was have maybe some kind of calibration meeting. So like record everything for sure, and then have, okay, you're saying sort of 5 to 8 testers, sure. So have a meeting with the 5 to 8 testers and decide, what are you looking for? How much help are you going to give? And then maybe the first, 3 exams by each person, multiple people grade so that we get a good benchmark for what is a 5 out of 5, what is a 4, what is a 4.5. So I think it could work. You're right, absolutely, Rosita, that it has some drawbacks, but I think with good calibration, you could probably do it. And that would, again, obviously, if you've got 200 students, you can't do them all yourself, and so distributing the workload in that way might work. It's kind of a thing when you're marking, too. If you're marking math 135 where there's 1,600 students, there's obviously going to be multiple people marking the same question. And so having a meeting and looking at a small sample and then seeing how, kind of ironing out what are the conditions to get a perfect or whatever on each question is important in that case. And I think it's maybe more important in the oral exam because of what they say during the exam is also going to affect how people do. So I hope that kind of answers the question, that it definitely can work. It will take some time beforehand to decide how much help are you going to give people, what is good enough, and then maybe having some kind of calibration meeting. Maybe more than one, actually, one at the start and then one after you've done half of them just to readjust, and then hopefully that would work. I see another question, Diana. Do you have one oral exam per class per term, or do you use them multiple times? So far, I have only used them as a final, but I think that would be a great opportunity, especially if it's going to be worth a little bit more, to have more than one. So to have one after the midterm or before the midterm, honestly, and then one before the final or something like that. So, or you could even have one at the end of each major topic. So if your course maybe has 3 major topics in it, we could have one after 4 weeks and another one after week 8 and another one after week 12. So definitely some huge advantages there. As students become more comfortable with the process, their results will improve and they'll be able to get it because they won't be as nervous. They'll know what to expect. So I think it can work really well. Of course, the only problem is that then, if you're going to have 3 of them, that triples the amount of time that you're taking. So I definitely think that is a good idea. I've only ever used them as one per term, but you could use multiple per term. Diana, how well are students able to brainstorm possible questions based on the class notes? That's super interesting. Usually, so this is what I do. I go up to the board and I say, here are the 5 types of questions. You can see them on the slide right here. And I pick 2 types. Usually I like to do the define and the compare and contrast as my examples. And I ask them, if you were me, what would you want you to know? And then everyone thinks for a second. And okay, what's an important definition in the course? And it takes a little bit of time for the first one to come up, and then I think whatever they say, I say great, and I write that on the board. Does anyone have anything else? What's another important definition? And as soon as one is up on the board, the floodgates open, and people are like, oh, that's okay, yes, insurance policy, yes. It's pretty easy to get definitions going. And then the other thing I like to make them come up with is compare and contrast. So I'll say, what are two things that you think I want you to be able to tell me the similarities and differences between? So that one, again, is usually a little bit harder. People think for a while, and someone will come up with something, and then I'll write that down. And again, usually once one is up there, people realize, oh, okay, yeah, these two things that we talked about. So like, just speed and continuous time are job change, or, this versus this type of insurance versus that type of insurance. And once I've got usually like 3 or 4 of each type, type 1 and type 3 on the board, then I stop. Because at that point, they get the idea that like, as soon as you start, the ideas will keep coming. So having, doing that like in front of the class, I think is a real good way of starting off the discussion. And then that's when I give them the time. Like each one of them can pick one of the 6 or 8 questions that are on the board and like prepare for that and then test each other in like 3 minutes at a time. If you were trying to do that remotely, it might be better to actually give them sample questions. So, define blah, and then maybe you give like 2 examples. And then you can encourage people to come up with others. Because once they've seen 1 or 2, it's easier to think of others. So that's a really great question on how to brainstorm. Okay, we have another question. In a written exam, we have evidence of student work. So we have something to refer to when handling appeals. In oral exam, we do not have such a thing. Can we make a video and or audio recording of an oral exam? If so, what formalities should be handled to make this possible? Fabulous question. I was really concerned about that when I did oral exams for the first time, that someone might challenge their grade based on that. One way that I kind of minimized the risk of that was to make it not worth very much, but that's not the only the way to do that. The other thing I do when I did the oral exams, I would take very detailed notes about what the student was saying. And then because of the rubric that I had, so there was like a full point for coming up with an idea on their own and a half point for coming up with an idea with a hint. I had a little shorthand, so it was like a check mark and like a weird little hash check, like a V kind of, if it was a half point. So then later I could go over my notes, like if someone did challenge. No one ever did in the 400 of these that I've given. No one has ever asked, but I have it all. I kept it all. So if that happened, then I would be able to pull up my notes and say, okay, this is why they got this mark. They mentioned this, they mentioned that, they didn't mention it. They ran out of time for this question, whatever. I would recommend, if you're going to have it work more, it is a good idea to have a video or audio recording. For that, obviously, you would want to get the student's consent. I think it's very likely that they would grant it because if they don't, then basically they're saying they won't appeal. I'm not sure exactly how you would frame that, but I think it would be important to tell the student, like, because of this, so that we can review it later if necessary, would you be okay with me recording it? If you phrase it that way, then I think probably they'll all say yes. And then that would be something to keep. I would assume you would probably want to keep it for a year, the same rules as for keeping physical final exam paper. Hopefully you have a big Dropbox or OneDrive to keep all of those videos, because that would be a lot. Yes, so thank you for that question. Hopefully that answers it. I see another one here. Diana, you mentioned that you are using oral exams in addition to the written assessment. One of the attendees is planning to use it as the final assessment itself. Do you think this is reasonable? Yes, I do, with a couple of caveats. I think in that case, it might be nice to have more than one. So rather than have one at the end where it's 40%, it might be nice to have one partway through the term where it's maybe 15, and then another one at the end where it's 25 or something. Like, I'm not sure how to split the 40. But the advantage of that is, again, once the student has gone through the process once, they're going to be way better equipped to go through it again. They're going to know more, what it feels like to try to say what you need to say in 3 minutes. They're going to know how better to prepare. And so I think there's less stress on it. Everything, 40% of their grade riding on a 15-minute conversation with the instructor. What if they have a headache that day, Same thing is true with the 2.5-hour final exam, but there's a little bit more wiggle room there. So what I would suggest is, I think that's fine. Again, I'm not the expert, but I might suggest, if your class size allows it, to have an option or the ability to split that up. So you can even make it optional. So having the midterm, whatever, optional. So if they want to do it, like if a practice oral exam, they do that. If they do that, they get that to be 10% or 15% or whatever. And then the final one is worth 25. But if they choose not to do the midterm ones, they can have the last thing. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I just haven't said it without thinking about it. You might end up getting the people that like to procrastinate and just push all their work to the end, doing poorly on that, and you wouldn't want that. So that, hopefully that answers that question. I think if you have clear expectations, a good solid rubric that you're going to follow that's as objective as possible, a good idea to have recording if it's going to be worth that much of the exam, and either like splitting it up into two or giving people practice, then I think there's no problem with having it be worth 40%. And like European universities have 100% oral final exams sometimes. I don't think that's common to go that extreme, but they do exist. And so those might have multiple examiners. So hopefully that answers that question. Diana, when do students get the oral grade and feedback? Okay. Because of the way I use them, I consider that as part of the like final assessment of the course. So I don't release the grades for the oral exam until the end of the final exam period. So I basically follow the rules that go along with releasing written final exam grades. They have a pretty good idea of how it went, honestly. I'd say 90% of people have a really good idea of how it went. And remember that the way I do it again is I post the sort of point form answers that would be desirable. And so they'll see their own questions on the list and see, oh yeah, I remember saying that. Oh, I said that. Oh, I forgot to say that. Oh well. And so people have a pretty good sense. I don't think anyone is surprised by the grade they get. And again, I don't release them until after the end of the final exam period. I see another question. Diana, do you find it hard to be engaging for the last students? Does your attitude affect the students' performance? So I don't think it's the last students that's hard. It's the last students of a day that's the hardest. So my advice for you is to schedule yourself no more than like 6 in a row. I am an idiot, and some of the terms I just like booked myself, for 8 straight hours. I was like, anyone can sign up whenever they want. And of course, everybody signed up on the last possible day. So I think I had 18 in one day, and it was just too much. You can't just distinguish between them anymore. So I would make sure that you give yourself, maybe 4, and then a break, and then 4 more, and then a break or something, so that you're coming fresh. Because I think it really does affect their performance. Like if you're sitting there like, rolling your eyes, like it would be like an interview, right? It would be like being interviewed by someone who just isn't there for it. So I think it is important to be engaging, and so that when you're scheduling it, make sure that you give yourself enough time, breaks in between, so that you're not completely stuck dry by the end of it. The thing is actually, when they go well, it's engaging for me. Like it's energizing for me to see how much they've learned and how cool the stuff they think about can be. Like I find it really exciting sometimes. When it's bad, it's like pulling teeth. Just please give me anything. Give me any excuse to give you a mark. Like you're just giving your energy and they're just not responding. So a bad one can really kind of suck the energy out of the room. But most people do prepare pretty well. And those ones can be really, really insightful and enlightening and fun. Because it's a conversation. Like you're not just, deliver this information to me. Okay, here you go. Like it's a conversation. And when they say something neat, you can actually legitimately respond. Wow, that's a great point. And then they feel good too. So I think it is really important to have enough energy that you can be engaged in that process. And don't schedule yourself crammed full so that you lose your attentiveness. Another one just came in. Primary goal is to avoid students collaborating excessively or having someone else actually do the course for them. There are still ways students can find ways to get assistance during an oral exam. What are your thoughts on this? So, it's pretty obvious if someone is saying something that they don't actually understand. Or reading from a script in their head that someone else has written. And that's where I think the follow-up questions, I would take more liberties with, if you suspect that someone is just reading something that someone else wrote, you can interrupt them and say, that's really great. Can you tell me more about this? So try to get them off their script if they literally, like, if you don't think that they're actually speaking from their own experience or knowledge. The one thing, though, I think if a whole bunch of students got together, like 5 students got together, thought of every single question that they thought I could conceivably ask, wrote down or discussed amongst each other ideal answers to all of those questions, and then memorized the script with all of those answers, I would say they learned a lot. Like, I would say that's learning. They've done it. So I'm not too concerned about someone, like, having some help in terms of developing the answers to those questions, as long as they really do understand it. And that's where you can probe if you think that they're just saying something without understanding what they mean. So you can ask them to expand on something, or, like, you know, if you're talking about the advantages and disadvantages of something, you can be like, okay, but what about from this other perspective? So advantages and disadvantages of a pension plan from the policyholder's perspective are going to be different from the employer's perspective. You can flip the script somehow, and just make sure that you're sure that they know what they're saying. So does that kind of answer your question? I think if someone really did do all of that work to cheat on an oral exam, then you've tricked them into learning. So yay! Does that make sense? Hopefully. Saying, is it worth doing a video assessment versus an audio assessment? Thinking of file size. Yes, that is a very, very good point. Are you an extrovert? Yes. That should surprise no one. Do you think the introvert extrovert dynamic affects things? I think you could still give a very useful learning experience that's engaging, even if you're not an extrovert. I don't think that, certainly my enthusiasm comes through, but you can be introverted and enthusiastic too. So, my husband is a very, very strong introvert, so I'm trying to imagine what he would be like giving an oral exam to someone. I think it would be great. I think it would work really, really well, no matter who you are, because you know the material and you care about the material. And if you've designed questions that will engage the student and get them to learn at higher levels, then you will naturally be, like, impressed when they come up with something cool, and you will want to draw more out of them if they give you an unsatisfactory answer. So I think regardless of your personality type, I think you can deliver oral exams well and administer them well. All right. Okay, I want to move on because I know we don't have too much time left, and I want to leave some more time for the questions at the end. So I'm going to just jump ahead. We already talked about this. Oh yeah, so this was where I was going to jump to. My observations of the students during the exam. A lot were quite nervous at the start, and many of them even said, oh, I'm really nervous. But as soon as the first question was over with, or even in the middle of the first question, when they saw that I wanted them to succeed, like I would give them hints if they needed it, they calmed down really quickly, and everyone pretty much warmed up throughout the process. A lot of them mentioned that it was good practice for interviews. They really liked the immediate feedback that I would give them. So if they started going off the wrong track, I would just be like, okay, well, let's come back over here. And they really liked that instant feedback, because when you're writing a final exam and you have no idea whether you're getting it right, that can be really nerve-wracking. So getting them back on track right away is valuable. I find it really, really valuable to assess their learning. Like, I think I can learn more about what someone knows and the depth of their knowledge in a 15-minute conversation than I can in a 2.5-hour written exam, easily. I don't know if that's true, but I feel like that's true. And sometimes they really do come up with amazing connections and ideas and advantages and disadvantages that I never even thought of. So then I feel those when I add them to my list. But it's really cool to see what they can come up with when you let them explore these topics. A very small number of people clearly did absolutely no preparation, and it's extremely obvious and really painful. And a couple of times, maybe 5 times total out of the 400, I've just stopped the exam and said, we're done, come back tomorrow when you're prepared, and just given them a 24-hour extension and just sent them away. And then they came back the next day, I gave them 5 new questions, and they all really came through. Because, I mean, they know they're doing badly. It's just embarrassing, and there's no point prolonging the misery of that. It's just so uncomfortable for both of you. So in extreme cases only, I would just say, forget it, let's call it, go away, come back in 24 hours. A couple of observations from the students. I'm not going to read all of these, but their students, this was comments that people gave after they were no longer my students. So they're not just saying this to butter me up, but people mentioned lots of really nice things about, not just be able to do the math, but to explain concepts. They found it a positive experience. They liked that we provided guidance. I like this last one, my favorite, because I actually had to learn to understand the concept in order to communicate them effectively. It sounds like I tricked them to actually learn. A few more, just a lot easier to understand the formulas if you understand the underlying idea. Really helps the students. I love it. Showing the importance of communication. It's, how you assess your students is what they're going to interpret as what is important. So if you make this a big part of the assessment, then they'll understand that this is an important thing. Someone recommending they spread it to the whole department. So yeah, let's do it. And interpretation of concept. Alrighty, so finally, just wrapping things up, I know I've gone longer than I meant to, I'm sorry. My recommendation is to give students guidelines, very clear, however you want to do it, make it clear what you want them to do, and if you can, practice opportunities. Someone mentioned, can you get people to do calculations orally? That's really difficult. You kind of have to focus on more of the conceptual stuff and maybe test the calculations through a different medium. Obviously, you want to try and take as many steps as you can to minimize those disadvantages and emphasize to the students the value of this process, not as just an assessment, but as something that will help their learning as well. One thing that students have told me is my exams are just completely open books. I could bring in absolutely everything. And they said, I wish you had limited us to, a few pages because it's too hard, it's too much when you have everything. So I do this now. I suggest that they prepare some summary notes, but they are still allowed to bring in everything if they want. So it's not like a limit, but more like it's a good idea to do that summary yourself. And if you can, it's nice to balance the coverage and difficulty of questions. So the way I do it is I've got 5 question types. I divide my course material into roughly 5 sections, and then I make up one question type for each section of course material, and then I pick one of each, so that they'll get one question type and all the coverage of the course, so it'll be relatively balanced. So that's what I suggest. I have a cool spreadsheet. If you want it, I can make it available. And finally, in terms of implementing it with remote teaching specifically, one thing that's not as much of a concern actually is the time zone, because you don't need everybody doing it at the same time now. You can schedule it individually. So it might be 9 p.m. for them and 9 a.m. for you, but if you're both cool with that, then cool. So it's less of a concern because you don't need everyone at the same time. One of my colleagues loves this site, youcanbook.me, and so that's really, I think they're having a free 14-day trial, so if you want to start that right before your final exam period, go for it. A low bandwidth option, which would be really valuable, is to do it audio only. So rather than a video chat, do it with either a phone chat only, like a literal phone, or some kind of web-related audio-only channel. For people that are teaching larger classes, I have a few suggestions about how you can still use it. So you could use it just for borderline cases. So again, if someone does, below a certain threshold, say below 60 on the midterm, then maybe you get them to come in and do an oral exam, just to make sure that they brush up on that stuff. You could also do it as a replacement for a missed assessment. So if you miss the midterm, then you have to do the oral exam as well as the written final or whatever. The other thing is you could just make it up to you, and if you have any concerns about the integrity, you can be like, okay, you have to do an oral exam. So obviously you'd want to be clear in the syllabus under what conditions, you may be asked to do an oral exam if you're not going to make everyone do it. Or of course you could just have it be optional. If you have the opt-in, that would probably be a much better experience because only the people who are confident in their abilities will opt in. But there's lots of ways that you could use it in a class that's bigger than you would want to handle by yourself. The one thing that's even easier with remote teaching is that you're already doing it through some kind of electronic medium, so it's easier to record. So, if you're thinking about sitting in your office with a student, setting up a video camera is really obtrusive, but if you're on a chat, it's easy to record. So obviously you do want to get consent from the student, but that's a way that you could do that fairly easily. So I have exhausted my time and my slides. but I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes. If there are additional questions, please type them in the chat and I will answer them as best I can. I apologize for going a little bit over. Maybe we should stop at 4:35 and then it'll be exactly 1 hour. How about that?
I was going to say that's a good idea. Like 5 more minutes and just let any lingering questions come in.
Fabulous. Cool. So yes, if you have any questions or comments, or even like replies to other people's questions, if you have ideas for them, please pop them in the chat and we will take them as they come. Okay. For a comment and a question, this semester many students will be taking courses online while being in their home country. For someone in China, video connection might be an issue, and for oral exams it might be a good idea to use those platforms that have servers present there for an audio. Yes, 100% agreed. So for sure, if like connectivity is an issue, then they can opt to do audio only rather than audio plus video. And then there are, I'm sure there are platforms that are reliable for audio chat in China. The one that comes to mind is WeChat. I don't know if there are others. I'm sure there are. So finding something that they won't be cut off in the middle or they won't have poor reception. And yeah, if you'd rather do it with, if the student or you or both would rather do it with audio only rather than audio and video, then that works great. So any further questions? Sounds like that's it. Well, I hope that I've maybe given you some ideas. If you want to use them, I'll make sure, so I know this is going to get recorded and posted somewhere. I'll see if I can get my spreadsheet that I use to generate questions posted somewhere where you can access it. At the very least, I can put it on my website, which is uwaterloo.ca/scholar/DKChizho. And if you have questions about your specific situation, send me an email, dkchizho@uwaterloo.ca. Here on Twitter, I'm @AskIProf. I don't use it much anymore, but I used to. And best of luck. I hope that the pandemic ends at some point, but you can keep using oral exams when everyone's back on campus too. I find it really, really nice. And again, it's a great way to get the students to demonstrate their knowledge and discover new knowledge even right in front of you. It's really an exciting process. And again, students, vast majority of them find it a good experience. Even if it's a little bit weird, once they've done it, they realize, okay, yeah, this really did help me prepare. Fabulous. Thank you all.
Before we just quick to Diana, so thank you to you for doing this and sharing your knowledge about this. I think it's fantastic stuff and really indeed useful for remote teaching. And we will put this recorded webinar on the Keep Learning website. So that could be a place as well. Like we'll probably have a separate page that we can add additional resources to that you might have, Diana. So we can keep everything there and make it available to everyone. But again, thank you so much for doing this. Fantastic to hear all these new ideas. It's been great just learning from you. So thank you.
Cool, thank you so much. I do have as well the references here. I forgot to mention that. So these are the ones that I referred to in my talk. There's other stuff out there. A lot of these are kind of old, but I'm sure there's been more recent stuff, but this is just back from when I did my research project on it. I encourage you to check those out if you want more perspectives other than just mine, of course. And yeah.